It's going to be really hard to match the energy of that last presentation. I feel like I'm the only speaker here that's going to use note cards, but I get nervous, so it's just insurance. But, yeah, this was originally going to be evaluating site conditions for smart species selection. It still is, but since this is, the seed conference, I wanted to focus in a little more on seed farming. So let's get right into it. The concepts in this presentation come from the book I've been writing for the past 2 years, Ruthless Nature. It draws on really over 10 years of research and observation. But I won't waste any more time. I do need the ability to move my slides though.
The down arrow is the next one.
Okay. So before I want to talk about seed farming, I want to talk about the other alternative method of seed collection, which is roadside seed collection. And I'm not here to bag on roadside seed collecting. It's great, it's quick and easy. If you're looking for like high quality, specialized seed that will thrive in local conditions, environments that are nearby you. And it's a fantastic method of getting, medium quantities of seed. But the problem with roadside seed collecting is that just by its nature, it cannot be scaled up to meet the needs of a growing, native landscaping and restoration business. And so the question becomes, how do we achieve, the quality and ease of seed that we get with roadside seed collecting, but with the quantity that you get and consistency that you get from seed farming? Well, to do that, we really have to shift the paradigm for seed farming entirely from basically planting any old seed you really want in the same X corn soybean field to really looking at the conditions that are present in your environment and finding species that will be able to thrive in that environment. But it's worth asking, why should a seed farmer care about this stuff? So as the buyer of seed, obviously you want quality and quantity at the same time, but what benefits do these practices that I'm about to share with you have for the seed farmer? And the answer is that the spectacular yields that they will get from using these practices in combination with the lower costs that they're actually going to see of being a seed farmer in the first place is going to increase their profits a lot, which is good for the seed farmer. Obviously, you want to make more money, and it will allow them to grow their operations so they so choose. I've got this basic little formula down here. So if you took Econ 101, lower cost of production is going to equal higher supply and lower prices for the consumer. And I think we can all agree that that's going to be good for everyone. But how exactly do we do this? Well, I'll give you a preview of some of the key concepts here. So we need to respect constraints, we need to look at soil moisture, and we need to achieve sustainability. Now I'll talk more about this stuff more in depth later, but essentially a constraint is any environmental condition that will either hinder the growth of or outright kill a particular species of native plant. Soil moisture is the proportion of unit of soil that is taken up by water that can be easily absorbed by the plant, and that's one specific example of a constraint. And then sustainability, just the ability to have a population, a native species, a crop that can sustain itself over time, over multiple seasons, that doesn't require a lot of intervention in order to keep it alive. Let's see, so, yeah, that was out of order. But let me give you an example. So we were able to, with only 2 acres of land, produce over 300 pounds of seed that sell for about $135 per pound. But the neat thing about this is not just these statistics, but we will be able to come back to this crop next season and the season afterwards and the season afterwards and keep harvesting it over time with minimal input. We don't have to go through and spray herbicide constantly, mow constantly. This plant population sustains itself. It produces seed by itself, and really all we have to do is come and harvest it at the right time. So let's talk about constraints. Now, a constraint is any ecological condition which can limit the growth of or kill a poorly chosen species. Now, we know that generally the conditions that are present on a site are going to define what species are able to grow there. But it's important to remember that if you're talking about a nursery setting, you can grow virtually any native species in the same nursery conditions. So the question becomes not what we have to give plants in order for them to survive, what they want, but we have to avoid what is constraining them. Because what you see a lot is when we take seedlings, and bigger plants out of the nursery setting and put them in a real world environment, all of a sudden a lot of them will fail. And we can be really confused as to why, because we don't understand if we're giving the plant everything that it needs, why isn't it growing? Well, the answer is that something, these constraining factors are killing it. And when you take a plant out of a safe nursery environment and put it in the real world, all of a sudden it's experiencing a cornucopia of just various different constraints that it has to overcome, all of them, just to survive. Let's see. So for the seed farmer specifically, what this means is that if you sow a crop and it fails, that means that the species you chose to grow, unfortunately, is too badly constrained by the environment you've planted it in order to survive. And so there really is no amount of intervention that you can do to get that species to be able to grow there. You just have to shift to a different species. You have to find something that works on its own. So what this means is that instead of just picking a species for demand, if you know that that species is going to be in high demand next season, if you have a buyer lined up, that's all great. But if you can't actually grow that species in your environment, then you won't be able to produce the seed that you're hoping to sell. And that's just going to be bad for everyone. So learn the constraints that you're working with in your environments, and you have to choose species that will be successful there. But I also don't want you, to get hopeless, especially if you are a seed farmer in the audience. It may seem like these constraints are just another obstacle that you have to overcome, but actually, if you think about it, the constraints have been there the whole time. You've been working with them this whole time. I'm just trying to shift your perspective from giving the plant what it wants to avoiding those things that will kill it. And I want to give you some examples of how shifting your perspective like this can actually reveal some hidden opportunities. So I think we've all seen environments like this, pretty hellish for most species, full sun, extremely dry, rocky soil, almost no nutrients. When we try to plant most species here, they will fail because there just isn't enough there for them. And so most of us kind of come to the same general conclusion, which is that you can't really grow much here. And so we should just give up. We should not try to work with environments like this. But is this actually an insurmountable set of constraints being imposed by this environment, or is it a hidden opportunity to maybe grow something a little unconventional? Well, I'm sure you can guess the answer. This kind of environment is perfect for growing Schizophyrium scoparium. Now, the scoparium, thrives in environments that don't have a lot of nutrients. It's able to survive in that sort of space. It needs full sun, doesn't need a lot of water, but it is constrained by too much water. It can be drowned. It can be constrained by over-competition from other species, which is why it actually thrives better here than in other places that traditionally you would think are better for plants, because here's where it can avoid that over saturation of water. It's where it can avoid that kind of competition. But I'll go to another example. This is another type of environment that we maybe are not disposed to try to work with a lot if we can avoid it. It's a floodplain, so subject to lots of water, full sun. It's got very nutrient-rich soil that can encourage high competition between invasive species and native species. And so we can be loath to try to grow anything here because we know that it will eventually just get choked out by everything else that's trying to take advantage of these good conditions. So is this an insurmountable set of constraints, or is it a hidden opportunity? Well, I'm sure you can guess after my last example, it's perfect for Verbena histata. Now, the histata thrives in this kind of environment that has high sun, high water, high nutrients, but it is also able to survive that kind of competition I'm talking about. Whereas what it can't survive, what it is constrained by, is a lack of water, a lack of sun, a lack of nutrients, which is why you don't tend to see it growing in that kind of environment. So you can see what I'm saying here. You really have to choose species that have evolved over time to survive the constraints that are being imposed by a site. But we can also look at this from the other perspective. Instead of looking at the constraints imposed by a site and then picking a species that can work there, we can pick a species we really want to grow for some reason, and then try to find an environment that lacks those constraints that will kill that species. But the question becomes, if you don't know the constraints for a particular species, let's just say American chestnut, should you actually plant that plant? Well, the answer is resoundingly no. I mean, do not pass go, do not collect $200. You can't do it, because if you don't know the constraints that will kill a certain plant, wherever you are selling it, you are taking a gamble on whether or not it will survive. And you might as well just take yourself to a casino. You'll get better returns there, because you have no guarantee that you will actually be able to harvest seed from this plant later on. But I also want to look at a specific example of a constraint that I find really fascinating. So soil moisture. Now, soil moisture is just, the proportion of a unit of soil that is made up of water, like I said before. And unfortunately, soil moisture, we have found, must be in a very narrow range in order for most native species to survive. It's a very particular thing for them. Because obviously it's very important. It determines, how much water a plant will be able to absorb, but also the likelihood of, their roots rotting, everything else you come to associate with too much water. It can be influenced by a number of factors. You have rainfall, climate patterns, temperature, pressure deficit, all sorts of things. But the point is that it needs to be very specific for most species to survive. But I want to show you some research we've actually done on soil moisture. Now, I find this graph really fascinating. I'm going to try my best to get you guys to find it fascinating too. So what we've done here is, over time, we've created profiles for the average soil moisture level of the environments in which certain species are found to grow. In this case, we're looking at warm season grasses. So each of these bands represents a different species, and we're seeing here what kinds of environments they grow in. And you can see that they form these very horizontal bands that don't really tend to intersect with each other very much. And what that tells us is that the environments in which these species grow are very distinct when it comes to soil moisture. And actually, that soil moisture is kind of a distinguishing factor for where species can or can't grow. And when we look at this, we can kind of see why you never tend to see more than one species of warm season grass growing in the same environment, because the environments in which they thrive, the soil moisture profiles in which they are able to survive, are so distinct from each other that one species cannot survive under two sets of conditions. It has to be in just the right spot. And I can give you a couple of examples. So this line here, I don't know if you can still see it while the grain is up there, but the soil moisture over the course of an entire year in the environments we have found Treaton's flavus to grow ranges from about 14% soil moisture to 10% soil moisture. And so if you are working with a field that has a soil moisture profile that tends to stay in that range, then you should be able to grow this species with no problems, disregarding all the other constraints it might experience. But if you're working with a particularly dry or a particularly wet field, then it's simply, this species, the flavus, will not be able to grow there because it will be too badly constrained. As another example, the scomparium we were looking at before, you can see that it has an even narrower range of soil moisture in which it is able to survive. So it only ranges from about 6 to 4% of the soil is actually constituted by water. And that is why we tend to see it growing in that very dry environment I was showing you before, because this kind of profile is where it survives, and that's why you can't grow it in most places you would consider normal, places that you would consider to be conducive to the health of plants. But the other thing is sustainability. So you need your soil moisture to be in just the right range in order to achieve a sustainable planting. But what exactly is sustainability, and why exactly is it important, especially to a seed farmer? Because we might think that sustainability is just something for restorationists trying to create a natural environment that replicates what you would see normally. But for commercial practices and businesses, why would sustainability be important? Well, I can assure you that sustainability actually is a great business practice, because what it really means is that you can lower your inputs while at the same time increasing your outputs. Because if a planting is sustainable, that means you don't have to come back and replant it every year. That means you don't constantly have to mow or apply herbicide. And since it is sustainable, it will stay there. And like I described before, you can come back season after season after season and keep collecting seed. Now, In most cases, there will be, still a little bit of input required year by year, but it's going to be drastically less than what you see with most seed farming operations now, because they are still operating under the same old assumptions that you can just plant any seed in the same field, and as long as you give it water and light, it will grow. Now, we know that's not true, but it's hard to get that kind of idea out of the heads of so many people. But how do you achieve sustainability? How do you create a self-sustaining crop? Well, the key is to find a species that can both grow and survive in the conditions you're working with, but also produce seed that can fall and then germinate and then produce more plant individuals to replace the losses that you're inevitably going to see in a natural environment. And so if you find a species that is able to replicate itself, that means that that planting essentially is not even a crop necessarily anymore. It is just a plant community that exists there that you can come to at the right time of the season to harvest your seed. And the funny thing about this is that this actually opens up a lot of opportunity, because you don't just need to work with old farm fields. As long as the constraints are absent, you can plant, you can sow crop anywhere. You can even sow crop in, your brother's backyard, as long as the conditions are right, and just pay him a visit, once or twice a year to come collect the seed. It'll be great, trust me. But yeah, so this, if it is self-sustaining, like I said, you're going to drastically reduce the amount of effort that you have to put in to producing the seed in the first place, and you will also increase the amount of seed that you're going to get, because not only can you come back year after year, but perhaps that plant population will even grow over time if it really is that well suited to the environment you've put it in. For example, this seed farm here requires no herbicide whatsoever. And this might be, shocking to some people who really do rely on just the right herbicide application to keep certain species of plant alive. And so how is this possible? I mean, how can we create a plant community that will just stay here without that much intervention? And the answer, as I've said before, is just to match the right species with the right place. So in this case, you have local genetics matched to a local field. So this original founder seed for this crop was taken from a nearby spot, which means that we can be relatively confident that it will survive and grow in that sort of an area. And it was put into a field that matched where it was originally growing. So this species specifically is Pacra aurea var gracilis. It was sourced locally. We found an unused local field with optimal conditions, and we come through and mow it only twice a year just to keep weed invasive populations under control. And that's it. All we have to do besides that is come collect our seed and sell it. And I think that that's something that you would all want the ability to do too. So I've created a handy dandy self-sustenance checklist. So if you want to create a crop that is self-sustaining, these are really the four main things that you want to do. First, you want to get founder seed that is from your ecoregion, because the ecoregion represents an underlying set of conditions and constraints that you have to deal with. And you also want to get it from a location that is just on the surface similar to yours, because those conditions present there are equally as important. You also want to consider the constraints that are imposed by your fields, your environment specifically. So say you live in a place that's prone to early freezing in October or late freezing in April, you're not going to want to plant seedlings that can be killed by freezes like that. If you live in an area that's prone to heavy rainstorms in the summer, then you're not going to want to plant plants that can be washed away. I mean, this really is the key. If all you do is avoid killing your plants, they will survive, they will grow, and you will be able to harvest seed from them. The third thing is avoid using online seed vendors, that's kind of related to the first point. So what online seed vendors most of the time do is collect seed from all across the country, mostly from smaller growers, consolidate them into larger packages, and then just sell them to anyone who is buying them online. But inherently, if you're doing that, you cannot guarantee that you are getting seed from populations that are genetically attuned to survive in the environments that you're working with. And finally, you're not going to want to mix accessions. You're not going to want to mix different variants of the same species in either the same or adjacent plots, because what will happen is over time, those genes will intermix, and all of a sudden those plants will lose their specialization. They'll lose their like finely honed edge over all the other plants there and their ability to overcome the constraints that are imposed upon them. Yeah, so if you want help doing this, right now, for example, if you're really fascinated by these concepts and you want to find the right species, you can contact us at ArcheWild for help. We'll be happy to help you out. But if you're more interested in just the learning and the concept in general and being able to do this for yourself, getting that sense of what will survive and what won't, you can go ahead and buy the book, It's Nature. You can email me, cian.brownlee@archewild.com, and we are taking pre-orders. As soon as we get enough people interested in buying the book, we will be able to print it at a reasonable price and ship it out to anyone who wants it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very thought-provoking. I want to ask a combined question about, as someone who supports and tries to spread a similar philosophy in my practice in advising landowners and things like that, but I'm wondering what your success is in addressing questions about different kinds of constraints. So someone is also who's depending on a crop and selling that crop is dependent on, the question I get the most is economic constraints,
Yes.
but also predictability. Like, the question I get asked often is, if I depend on a niche crop, how will I be able to plan for the future if the market conditions change so demand drops out? Or slight variation in soil moisture from one year to the next due to unpredictable rains could completely devastate my niche crop. How do you address questions like that?
So those questions can be hard to address because if you do rely on something very niche, then unfortunately, as we've seen, if that plant is unable to grow for you next year, then there's not much that you can do to make it able to grow. If you're dealing with like an outlier sort of condition, one summer is really hot, you get a really bad drought, that's when you can get into heavier intervention in order to keep that population alive under 1 or 2 years of harsh conditions, and then it will pick back up once things return to normal. But if you're dealing with, a larger trend towards just conditions changing permanently, then unfortunately you're going to have to change the species you're working with because you still need to find something that will work with the new conditions. As far as niche species, there are always going to be multiple species that can survive under the same environment. I mean, that's why you see more than one species growing in the same place. But if most of them are not valuable, then unfortunately, yeah, it's going to be a little hard to find something that can, keep you going. But you also have to consider that there are lots of different growing environments that you can take advantage of. And so what a lot of people kind of get stuck in is, okay, if my field that I was using to grow corn and soybeans can't support this species that I'm trying to grow, then, there's nothing I can do, because if it can't grow there, it can't grow there. But really, you're not constrained to just your field. As long as it works, it works. And so, like I said, you can plant it in a backyard, you can plant it in an empty, unused field somewhere else, you can plant it down by a pond. I mean, you can plant it anywhere you want as long as it works. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Where are you based out of with this work?
We are based out of the Mid-Atlantic. We're in the Philadelphia area, but the hope is that since this is more of a perspective shift, really the area that you're in doesn't matter as much, because what I'm trying to do is not say specifically what constraints you should look at and specifically what species you should plant. I'm trying to just give you the ability to kind of figure that out on your own. And I know that a lot of you here are not from the East Coast, you're from the West Coast, and honestly, it may be even more important for you there, where a lot of species are native to a certain county, but that county has just a wide range of different conditions that actually exist within it because it's so large. And so it becomes important to analyze the conditions, the constraints that you're working with on a specific site, not just the general conditions in one larger area. Yeah. You were first, actually. You had your hand up for a while.
Yeah. Do you have a process to find or, I guess, evaluating constraints, species by species? I guess it's probably in the book, but like just roughly My role would be more to give advice to farmers that we're trying to ramp up seed production in our area. And so trying to, give them advice on how to decide, especially for species we don't have good information on, like, I guess, what does your research look like, and how do you decide what's a constraint and what's
So,
not?
I mean, it's hard if you, I mean, like I said in one of the slides, if you just don't have information on, what the constraints of a species are, it will be hard to find an environment where it works or doesn't. But there are, things that you can do. You can research, like, for example, we do have a methodology in the end of the book that helps you do this, but for example, comparing plant communities. So if you know that this plant you're trying to grow, plant X, grows alongside, plant Y and Z, then as long as you're working with an environment that can host those plants, if you see those kind of growing around just naturally, you can be relatively confident that plant X will also be able to grow there. As far as advising seed farmers, I would say that doing more research into the conditions of the environments that they're working with and not the species that they want to grow would be more helpful, because as much as for a year or two you can try to change the conditions on a site, it exists the way it does for a reason, and it's always going to return to that natural state. So if you're finding that the species you're trying to grow just aren't succeeding in that environment, then it probably will be better to find, a different crop to grow.
Have you tested this in an urban environment?
Urban environments are a little bit harder because you tend to see more constraints there, but you can absolutely put these concepts into practice in urban environments. I mean, constraints are constraints, so if your constraint is that you have, a lot of traffic, foot traffic maybe, let's say you're even trying to grow native species in just like the grass strips in a parking lot. That is still possible as long as you find species that can survive those conditions, and there always are going to be. I mean, that is one thing. I think that no matter what the conditions are that you're working with, there will be at least a few species that can survive that. You just have to find out which ones they are.
Have you given any consideration to talking about polycultures, or even really simple ones, to think about, like, potentially multiple plants supporting each other in weed suppression, or having multiple different harvests per year?
Yeah, and so that's actually like the plant community thing I was talking about earlier. So I mean, this presentation was focused more on seed farmers, but really the book comes from the perspective of like ecological restoration. And so you're right. I mean, finding a plant community that works together as kind of a cohesive unit in an environment is definitely going to be a lot more successful than just planting individual species that can, overcome those constraints that are present, because that is how plant species evolved in the first place. They evolved alongside each other. They evolved relying on conditions that were created by other species. I mean, think of canopy cover as a great example. I mean, you need trees to provide canopy in the first place if you have a species that needs that. And that's not something that you want to artificially create. You just want to let the plants, provide those services to each other. So absolutely, that's very important.
I have a question about the genetics part. It was my understanding that you want lots of different populations to come together so that, they can figure out how to best suit that site.
Well, generally, that idea is that if you put lots of different genetics into the same place, then the ones that can survive will win out. But what you can see is this phenomenon called outbreeding depression, which we do cover a little bit in the book, where the average genes are less suitable than, the individuals that they came from. And so when the whole population kind of gets homogenized, all of a sudden all of them can die, as opposed to just the half that has the right gene surviving versus the half that has the wrong gene not surviving.
Thank you for your presentation. It was fascinating. I'm just wondering, how many species do you grow in this method, and what is the scale of your farm? How many acres?
Well, the property that we are working with is only 5 acres, and so that means that we are working with a limited set of conditions, but we have been able to find plants that work there. And as far as how many species you want to grow, we have found that in any particular environment, you're going to have 8 to 12 core species that make up about 80 to 90% of the individual plants. And then that remaining 10 to 20% of individuals is going to be made up of all the outlier species. So your core group is going to be 8 to 12, and then whatever else you can kind of fit in those outskirts, those niches, you can feel free. Did you have a question? Sorry.
It was related to what,
Do you plant in like blocks and rows, or is it?
Plants don't naturally
Yeah,
really
right.
grow in blocks and rows, so you really want to, just create a community that works, and you can just go collect the seed, even though, agriculturally.
Do you then use mechanical harvesting equipment, or?
Well, I guess, yes. So if you can find species that work in that format and that helps, with being able to use equipment and making the harvesting more efficient, then yes, absolutely feel free to. But if the species you're growing don't work in blocks and rows, then they don't work in blocks and rows, and unfortunately there's not much you can do to make them, compatible with that equipment you're trying to use. All right.
So
Thank you.
is the book available, but you were saying the book's not available now?
The book is not currently available, but once enough people want to buy it, we can print it out and ship
And
it
how
out.
do we let people know we want to buy it?
I can give you a business card that has
okay.
my email on it. All you have to do is email me and
Okay.
say, hey, I'm interested. Put me on the email list, put me on the list of people who want to buy the book.
Okay.
And as soon as we get enough people that we can kind of print it at a quantity that we can provide it for a reasonable price, then we're going to do that.
Okay.
Would you mind putting your email address actually on the board?
Here or
Yeah.
there?
Anywhere you can.
Do I have a marker
right?
here? Just Cian Brownlee at ArcheWild. So that's Architects of Wild Spaces, ArcheWild.com. Couldn't really fit the com in there, but.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.